The idea that Bob Dylan's 1980s output reflected some kind of creative nadir for the dude is complete and utter nonsense. Anyone who offhandedly dismisses all of his 1980s stuff as some kind of nadir creatively for this songwriter doesn't know what they're talking about, hasn't done the digging necessary to dig up the many gems that existed within this 10-year span later on, mid-career Dylan, right, in the 1980s. And that's perhaps to some extent part of the problem is you do have to do a little digging. The best of Dylan's work in that decade is not served on a silver platter or spoon fed to you like it was in the 1960s when it was right on its face. The first track on Highway 61 Revisited is the greatest song he ever uh, uh, made, which is like a Rolling Stone, the most impactful, the most consequential song, the most world changing and music changing song of his life was the opening track on that legendary record. You don't get that with Dylan's 80s stuff. In fact, the most legendary stuff that he recorded in the decade, I would argue most of the most legendary stuff he recorded in that decade is hidden. It's outtakes. It wasn't ever included on the official releases in some cases, much to the dismay, chagrin, and torment of the producers he worked with on some of those records, in particular Daniel Lanois on 1989's Oh Mercy, who practically begged Dylan to include a number of masterpieces that Dylan adamantly refused to include on the record. He did this most notably in 1983 with Infidels and in 1989 with Oh Mercy. So he has had a tendency, especially in that period, to sabotage his own work. What comes to mind as I say this is during his acceptance speech at the 1998 Grammy Awards, when he won Album of the Year for Time Out of Mind, released in 1997. I forget exactly who he was referencing in his acceptance speech, but at one point he said that someone he worked with on the album was dismayed because his favorite songs from the Time Out of Mind session were not included on the album. You can hear all of that stuff on Bootleg Series Volume 8, Telltale Signs, that came out in 2008. But it's just interesting that this is what Dylan has done to the people he's worked with throughout his career as a matter of routine. He records and he writes and records these masterpieces, and everyone but Dylan either seems to hear that it's a masterpiece, or Dylan too hears that it's a masterpiece, but out of some kind of self-spite or tendency towards sabotage or whatever it might be, he won't let it out. He won't let it out into the world. Now, thankfully, in large part, with the Columbia Records bootleg series, and to some extent the underground bootlegs that have circulated in record stores for decades, this stuff has found its way into the public in one way or another. I'm going to go through here in this video what I consider to be 10 masterpieces from Bob Dylan's 1980s period, with one honorable mention, a track called God Knows. It didn't quite make the cut of 10, but easily could have. And I know that there are more than, believe me, I understand. And if you're like some kind of Dylanologist or whatever watching this video, and you're like, 10, what do you, I understand that there are more than 10. This is my list. These are my 10. I could have done 25. But then I'd be sitting here talking to you for 3.5 hours, and nobody wants that, right? So just for the purpose of this video, I culled what I consider to be 10 masterpieces from this much maligned, unjustly so, period of the 1980s. And on this point of tracks that Dylan left off that turned out to be masterpieces, as undoubtedly is the case again and again, as I think I'm about to convincingly show you, and it's not just me talking this way about the outtakes from throughout Dylan's 1980s period. It's Bruce Springsteen, it's Grail Marcus, some of our greatest music critics, all are saying the same thing about the same batch of songs that Dylan recorded in the 1980s. They are putting this work on par with the greatest work of his life, going all the way back to his eponymous debut in 1962. Okay, again and again and again, you're going to hear very famous, distinguished, successful peers like Bruce Springsteen, like Tom Waits, great music critics like Grail Marcus and others, all saying the same thing. This stuff is worthy of the work in his canon that enjoys the greatest regard that his output has amassed over the decades. And it's all from this stuff is all from the 1980s, this so-called fallow period in his career or whatever. So this is the part of what's perplexing about it. When you listen to these outtakes, there's this great YouTube comment on a version of Caribbean Wind, one of the tracks that I'm going to talk about on this list of 10, that says Dylan's outtakes are anyone else's ticket to the Hall of Fame. Exactly. I mean, these 10 songs, if any other artist had recorded these 10 songs in whatever decade, that artist would in and of himself or herself be legendary, a legendary songwriter. 10 songs of this kind of brilliance in anyone's canon is as enviable as it gets. Any other songwriter would probably kill to have these song credits attached to his or her name. And these, as this YouTube commenter astutely observes, are the toss-offs in Dylan's career. Listen, for me, the bottom line is this. A man who changes the world with a pen is not a man who somehow forgets how to use a pen. A man whose songs change music is not a man who suddenly forgets how to write songs. Dylan never forgot how to write a song. When you really dig into the lyrics of his 1980s output, songs like Joker Man and Infidels, songs like Foot of Pride left off of Infidels, songs like Dark Eyes, one of the most gorgeously written tunes of his career from 1985's Empire Burlesque, songs like Every Grain of Sand from 1981's Shot of Love, another record that in its entirety, I believe, is unjustly maligned. These are these are songs that any other songwriter would absolutely kill to have to their credit. Bruce Springsteen may himself be one of them. When Bruce was inducting Bob Dylan into the Hall of Fame, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1988, he had briefly turned his attention to the work that Dylan then was producing by the late 1980s. And he said this at that time. Again, this is from 1988. Okay, so by then Dylan has released a host of albums. You had Shot of Love in 81, Infidels in 83, Empire Burlesque in 85, Knocked Out Loaded in 86, right? Including a little toss-off track in 86 that he recorded with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers that we'll talk about. That's one of his most wonderful tunes from that period. Bruce Springsteen said Bob's own modern work, now by modern, again, at that moment, this was said in 1988, so he's talking about Dylan's 80s output, okay? Bob's own modern work has gone unjustly appreciated for having to stand in that shadow. Of course, he's referring to the shadow of Dylan's prior work, especially that mid to late 1960s stuff, right? If there was a young guy out there writing Sweetheart Like You, that's a track from Infidels in 1983, writing the Empire Burlesque album, again from 1985, writing Every Grain of Sand from 1981's Shot of Love, they'd be calling him the new Bob Dylan. Now, this is Bruce Springsteen saying this. Is someone going to tell Bruce he doesn't know what he's talking about? I mean, here's another guy who's written some of the most anthemic and impactful and consequential songs and records in human history, right? Certainly in the last 60 years, saying this specifically about Dylan's 1980s work that's supposed to be some kind of, again, creative nadir for him. I love what the music critic Peter Tabakis says about Blind Willie McTell, tragically an outtake from the 1983 album Infidels, which somehow survived all of these tragic omissions to still stand as one of Dylan's better later day records. But Tabakis says this specifically about this one outtake, Blind Willie McTell. A 6-minute, he calls it a 6-minute repudiation of any argument that somehow insists Dylan's 80s output was fallow. Personally, I think every one of the 10 songs I'm going to discuss here in this video qualifies as a repudiation of that idea, that somehow Dylan's 80s output is this no man's land of creative waste and wasted time, and Dylan was washed up at that period or whatever it is. It's all BS. It's crap. You just have to do a little digging, and that's what we're going to do together here. To really understand that he was every bit as capable of producing immense work of immense power, work that is every bit as powerful as the stuff that typically is attributed to his creative peak or whatever in the mid to late 1960s. And I'm hopeful that in the decades and even centuries to come, these songs will rank alongside his best work, whatever we consider to be best. Typically, that's, again, assigned to his 1960s period, as they absolutely should. I trust that time will bear this out. Okay, it might take a while. I mean, how long did Bach's work go neglected before it really became as well known and as universally regarded as it is today? Decades after Bach's death, his work languished in obscurity for the most part. So let's start with, we're doing a little countdown here. We'll start with number 10 on my list, which is a track called Band of the Hand. Now, this track was was part of the soundtrack for an absolutely miserable film called Band of the Hand, right? It has checks notes a 0% critical rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Yes, 0%. There wasn't even a fractional a fraction of a favorable review for this film. The synopsis for which on Rotten Tomatoes reads as follows: An Indian Vietnam veteran trains 5 street punks in the Everglades to fight vice in Miami. One reviewer of the film says the following about it: quote, dumb movies are with us always, but it isn't every week that we have a Band of the Hand. Flawlessly false, it breaks into the elite of the super stupid. So it is just like Dylan to have one of his greatest songs of the entire decade attached to such ridiculousness, right? This is how it happened in the 80s. He records this great song with a great backing band, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. They record the song in 1986 in Australia when they're touring that country together. And it's attached to this film that is destined for unending obscurity and ridicule, okay? There was nothing dumb or stupid about Band of the Hand. This is a wonderful song. Again, recorded at a time when Petty and Dylan are touring Australia. Just a couple years, by the way, before they collaborated together along with Roy Orbison, Jeff Lynne, and George Harrison on the first Traveling Wilburys album in 1988, which has some of Dylan's greatest songs on it, including Tweeter and the Monkey Man. But this was admittedly, yes. I mean, at that very moment in the 80s, these two were not necessarily releasing their greatest studio records, okay? Dylan's 1986 album, Knocked Out Loaded, has a 2 out of 5 star rating on allmusic.com. Probably deservedly so, I will admit. It's still a fascinating project. He collaborates with Sam Shepard on Brownsville Girl. He collaborates with Tom Petty on I've Got My Mind Made Up. He collaborates with a songwriter named Carol Bayer Sager, who wrote this fascinating story you've got to see in the description. I'll link to it there. I'll just read you a little bit about what she recalls about writing a song, the last song on that album called Under Your Spell. She says she was blown away by what an unlikely pair they made together. He completely disheveled from head to toe, and I in full makeup, tight jeans, t-shirt, and studded leather jacket. I was wearing my faux rock and roll look and failing miserably. And he could have told me he had come in from just rolling around with some farm animals, and I would not have disbelieved him. He looked like he hadn't bathed in weeks. There's this wonderful, charming moment where she recalls asking Dylan, because she's writing with him in person inside this barn structure at his Malibu, California property. She says, so do you have any ideas for what you feel like writing? Dylan said, well, I've got a little bit of an idea, but it sounded so garbled that to her, she said, he mumbled the words very softly. I thought he said, I got a little bit of deer. So she goes on to recount this wonderful and bizarre, strange experience she has writing this song with Bob Dylan as the last track of Knocked Out Loaded. So yes, this was an odd moment in the careers of both Dylan and Petty. But there's a vibrant energy on this track, Band of the Hand, the link to which I absolutely will embed in the description of this video, where you can find links to all 10 and the honorable mention 11th song that I'm going to discuss here in this video. Please check out the description for those links. Go and listen to these songs if you haven't already, if you're not familiar with them. If you're someone who is stunned to realize that maybe the stuff that Dylan was recording in the 1980s is certainly of at least as much value as anything else he did at any period in his career, go to the description for the links that I will post there to each of the songs I'm going to discuss today. There's this sort of, Dylan's got this soaring vocal performance on Band of the Hand. There's these gritty crunching harmonies, this synchronicity between Mike Campbell's crunching electric guitar and Ben Montench's wonderful organ work here, which kind of makes the song, in my view. This whole performance, to me, foreshadows the joy and delight that Bob Dylan would take in recording with the band, as we heard on the Traveling Wilburys album that came out less than 2 years after this was recorded in Australia in 1986, that Wilburys record coming out in 88. It's these moments in Dylan's career, like he experiences on Band of the Hand, when circumstances seem to let him let loose, that he's unburdened from the weight of his immense legacy, recording with a band. He doesn't have to just be Bob Dylan recording another Bob Dylan song. He can have some rollicking fun with a great rock band, a great rocking unit in Petty and his group. Those are the circumstances in which he's recorded some of his most powerful music. And you add Howie Epstein, the brilliant, sadly departed bassist, Stan Lynch on drums. They together, that bass and drum duo that formed the spine of this great rock and roll band that Tom Petty had behind him throughout his career. And you've got what sounds on the record to be a rather inspired Dylan, who seems to be having a hell of a lot of fun recording with the band here. It's great stuff. And it's a really rocking tune by Dylan's standards too. So check that out. Go to the link in the description and see what you think about Band of the Hand. There's also Born in Time. This is number 9 on my list now, Born in Time. You can find a pretty uninspired version of the song to my ear on the critically panned 1990 album Under the Red Sky that Dylan at times has tried to cast off as a children's album. I think that on that version, Elton John plays piano. It's really weird. And Dylan's vocal performance is anything but inspired. It's really unfortunate what he does to this song on that record, because the year before, in 1989, he records a killer version of Born in Time as part of the Oh Mercy sessions, okay? It's infinitely superior to that Under the Red Sky version we get. This features a lot of dobro playing, as you hear a lot throughout that wonderful Oh Mercy record from 1989. The dobro, which on this track I believe is played both by Dylan and Daniel Lanois, the producer of the track, really lends a unique stamp to many of the songs on Oh Mercy, and certainly is a welcome, has a welcome place on this track as well. You also have, interesting to me, Malcolm Byrne playing guitar on this track. Now, Malcolm Byrne, he produced one of what I consider to be one of the greatest records of the 1990s. That's Iggy Pop's American Caesar from 1993. So much great stuff on there. He later recorded an Emmylou Harris record. Didn't he produce Red Dirt Girl for Emmylou Harris, the follow-up to her wonderful Daniel Lanois produced 1995 record Wrecking Ball? And this guy, Malcolm Byrne, he's kind of a Lanois protege. He collaborated with Lanois on his first solo album in 1989 called Arcady. Byrne plays guitar on this track as well. So there's a nice mix of inspired producers and musicians on here, and that inspiration translates into a really fine performance. It's got almost like a soft rock feel to it, like an Alan Parsons Project type of sound to it. It's a really tight, structured, deeply melodic from first note to last, a ballad, I would say. I love this song, Born in Time. It's a really tender, sort of plaintive a ballad in Dylan's canon. The Big Issue placed this song, the Bootleg Series Volume 8. You can hear this track, this version recorded during the Oh Mercy sessions on Bootleg Series Volume 8, Telltale Signs, that came out in 2008. They ranked this version on that Bootleg Series collection at number 15 on a 2021 list of the 80 best Bob Dylan songs that aren't greatest hits. The Guardian in 2021 included this song, Born in Time, on their list of 80 Bob Dylan songs everyone should know, okay? And listen, talk about the beauty of Dylan's writing at this period in his career. Just the opening stanza. Listen to how gorgeous the writing is. In the lonely night, in the blinking stardust of a pale blue light, you're coming through me in black and white when we were made of dreams. Beautiful writing, beautiful opening stanza. That writing is as powerful as any that was being done at that time, in my view. Then you have Every Grain of Sand. This song is number 8 on my list, and it's given a reverent treatment by the aforementioned Emmylou Harris on her Daniel Lanois produced 1995 record Wrecking Ball, the title track for which is a Neil Young song. And unsurprisingly so, because Daniel Lanois had done this song or had done this album with Dylan in 89, and went into those sessions heavily steeped in Dylan's entire catalog. Daniel Lanois probably heard in this song Every Grain of Sand, which is a achingly tender, almost haunting ballad from the Shot of Love record in 1981. This is one of the few songs on my list, by the way, that actually did get an official release. Somehow survived Dylan's tragically, unfortunate appraisal of his own work in this period. So check that out, Emmylou Harris's version of this song, but definitely go to the Shot of Love sessions and hear Dylan's version too. There's something about his harmonica playing on this ballad that I find to be immensely powerful and deeply moving. It really pulls you into the song and doesn't let go until the final note. Now, these Shot of Love sessions were kind of a mess. Dylan recorded the Shot of Love songs across a variety of studios. He ran through a variety of producers. Jimmy Iovine was one of them. He is big time. I mean, he did Easter with Patti Smith. He did Born to Run with Bruce Springsteen. He did Damn the Torpedoes with Tom Petty. That's the record with Refugee on it. Well, for my money, their finest 3 minutes on tape. He did Rattle and Hum with U2. That was 88, right, with Desire on it, I think, right? Chuck Plotkin was another one that he worked with at one point in the Shot of Love sessions. This is a guy that worked with Springsteen too, Darkness on the Edge of Town in Nebraska. Bumps Blackwell, the guy behind Little Richard hits like Good Golly Miss Molly, Tutti Frutti, Long Tall Sally. He worked with Dylan's idol, Little Richard, and also had his hand in some of the recording on Shot of Love. So it's kind of a mess, right? And Bumps Blackwell was definitely at the tail end of his career. He died 5 years later in 1985. It was 62 at the time or so that he got involved with the Shot of Love project. So it was a very sort of scattershot, a hit or miss frenzy of creative fits and starts that Shot of Love emerged from it. And it's, I think, speaks to the power of Dylan's writing that a ballad as gorgeous as Every Grain of Sand survives all of that chaos. And really comes through as one of his finest moments on tape. And it's not just me talking that way about it. Clinton Halen, the Dylan scholar who's written a multitude of books about Bob Dylan, said it's perhaps his most sublime work to date. He goes on to say, the summation of a number of attempts in this song to express what the promise of redemption meant to him personally, one of his most intensely personal songs, it also remains one of his most universal, detailing the time of my confession, the hour of my deepest need. That's the opening line of the song. The song marks the conclusion of his evangelical period as a songwriter, something its position at the conclusion of Shot of Love tacitly acknowledges. Paul Nelson called Every Grain of Sand the chimes of freedom and Mr. Tambourine Man of Bob Dylan's Christian period. I mean, the praise doesn't get much higher than that, right? I mean, those are two of the greatest songs Dylan ever attached to his own name. He goes on to say that this song has, Every Grain of Sand, the surety and strength all down the line, also vulnerability. Dylan's beautifully idiosyncratic harmonica playing has metamorphosed into an archetype that pierces the heart and moistens the eye. And the lyrics don't let you down. The artist's Christianity is both palpable and comprehensible. For a moment or two, he touches you, and the gates of heaven dissolve into a universality that has nothing to do with most of the LP. I disagree with that. I love Shot of Love from first song to last. For me, there are some low points, but not very many of them. Property of Jesus, Groom Still Waiting at the Altar, In the Summertime. I even love Trouble. I love Dead Man, the title track. Bring it. Bring it all, Bob. I think Shot of Love is better than advertised. Music critic Tom Riley said of Every Grain of Sand that it is a prayer that inhabits the same intuitive zone as Blowin' in the Wind. You'd swear it was a hymn passed down through the ages. Rock critic Milo Miles says of the song, this is the one Dylan song in 10 years in which he examines a pop culture paradox that legendary stars in particular have to believe in ideals greater than themselves more eloquently than any other performer has. And as I said at the top of this video, Springsteen named this song, Every Grain of Sand, identified this song by name when he was trying to praise Dylan's 80s work as unjustly underappreciated. Which brings us to another song from the Shot of Love sessions, number 7 on my list, Caribbean Wind. Now, Caribbean Wind is a song that Dylan endlessly rewrote. There's one version that, to my ear, easily rises far above the rest of the many versions of this song that he put to tape. And Bob's own words help us understand his struggles with this song. He said of the song at one point, I couldn't quite grasp what Caribbean Wind was about after I finished it. Sometimes you write something to be very inspired and you won't quite finish it for one reason or another. Then you'll go back and try and pick it up. And the inspiration, it's just gone. Either you get it all and you can leave a few little pieces to fill in, or you're trying always to finish it off. And then it's a struggle. The inspiration's gone and you just can't remember why you started it in the first place. Frustration sets in, as it surely did with Caribbean Wind, which is one reason why ultimately, unfortunately, it gets left off of Shot of Love as the record. Tony Atwood, who's done a great deal of wonderful work on Bob Dylan's output over the decades, says, in the end, the most likely explanation as to why Dylan abandoned the song is simply because of the endless rewrites that had delivered a stream of interesting lines, but no coherence from one to the next. Now, the version that I link to in the description of this video is not just one of his greatest 80s songs. Forgive me, we've had a lot of cold fronts come through where I live, and my throat's a little dry. But not just one of his greatest 80s songs, but one of the greatest moments to be found in any period of Dylan's recording career. There's this sort of gritty explosiveness to the performance on this version, with Dylan really leaning into his vocals, especially during the chorus. It sort of captures lightning in a bottle in the way that Dylan's very finest work does. And when he gets there, when he finds that lightning, you must not overlook it, because it's going to be memorable and brilliant. This version was recorded at Studio 55 in Los Angeles in Studio A on March 31st, 1981. That, to me, is the pearl to pluck out of the oyster of Dylan's many versions of this song. It was the third Shot of Love recording session. This one was produced by Jimmy Iovine, by the way. It's got Dylan on vocals, Steve Ripley on guitar, Fred Tackett on guitar, Dave Mansfield on violin, Carl Pickard on keyboards, Tim Drummond on bass, and the great Jim Keltner on drums. You've got Bobby Hall on percussion, and Carolyn Dennis, a backup singer to whom Dylan was married from 86 to 92, and Madrina McCrary and Clyde King all doing backup vocals. The versions that we get on other collections like Biograph in 1985 or the 2017 Bootleg series, Volume 13, I think that one's called Trouble No More, right? Are pedestrian in comparison to this one, in my view. However, number 6 on my list is a masterpiece from that Bootleg series, Volume 13, Trouble No More, called Making a Liar Out of Me. Number 6 on my list here, Making a Liar Out of Me. So obscure was this track in Dylan's canon that Rolling Stone said of the song that up to its release in 2017, most hardcore fans had never heard this Save-era tune. I mentioned Clinton Heyland earlier. This is one of the premier Dylan scholars, right? He mentioned the song title in his book, Still on the Road, The Songs of Bob Dylan, 1974 to 2006. But other than that, absolutely nothing was known about it, Rolling Stone said of the song. Now, Heyland is quoted in that same Rolling Stone piece as saying this about the track. When I first heard it, I was struck by the fact that it is not just a proper song, but it was a 6.5 minute long song. It absolutely hits you in the solar plexus. There are some extraordinary lines in there, and they just seem to be pouring out. What's truly strange is that both the song and Yonder Comes Sin is that they didn't even make it into the live set, which is abundantly documented on that 2017 Bootleg series collection. They're both incredible, and they were dropped within a week of rehearsal. There he goes again, right? Recording work that even a Dylan scholar who's as familiar with the entirety of Dylan's catalog as anyone on this planet, he himself is calling this one of his greatest songs. And Dylan's just like, records it in a rehearsal and doesn't even bother performing it once on the tour. Never put it to tape in a studio session. Here again, you're reminded of that YouTube commenter about how this guy's outtakes are anyone else's ticket to the Hall of Fame. It's just one of the idiosyncrasies of Dylan's career and Dylan's canon. So, Making a Liar Out of Me, you got to hear it. Again, I'll link to all of these in the description of this video. Then we get to number 5 on my list. Here we go with the top half of my list now. Foot of Pride, which has a companion piece called Too Late. These are very different songs musically, but it's very similar lyrically. And so to some extent, I do think they go hand in hand. Tom Ward at allmusic.com, my favorite music site, as I've said on prior videos, says of Foot of Pride, which was originally recorded for the Infidels session in 1983, but left off of the freaking album, as Dylan, again, I just said, had a tendency to do. Tom Ward describes it as one of the most explosive and venomous songs Dylan has ever written, with the artist spitting out lyrics and verses cascading with potent imagery. Does this sound like a guy who had forgotten to write songs in the 1980s? I don't think so. As typical of Dylan's songs during this period, he mixes the spiritual with the secular, with lines such as, preacher talking about Christ betrayed, it's like the earth just opened and swallowed him up, are echoed throughout the song. Essentially a moralist song about the various wrongdoings of man, and then the chorus is a warning. There ain't no going back when your foot of pride comes down. Ain't no going back. Although the song delivers many eminently quotable lines, it's much too long and rambles in places, and it is perhaps understandable why Dylan chose to leave this off of Infidels. The artist has never performed the song live in concert, although Lou Reed did a justly famous rendition of it at the Bob Dylan 30th anniversary concert, which was at Madison Square Garden in 1992, celebrating the 30th anniversary of the release of his first record in 1962. Mastering the half-spoken, half-singing delivery of the verses expertly. Who better than Lou Reed to do just that, right? He did half-spoken, half-singing approaches to his songs throughout his career. I will link to that Lou Reed performance in the description of this video. It's well worth checking out. I beg to differ with Tom Ward just to the extent that, I don't think that the so-called rambling nature of this song in any way detracts from its power. This is a great track. You can find several versions of it. This is one song, speaking of versions, I think this is the song that Clinton Halen documents in his book about the recording sessions of throughout Bob Dylan's career, going from 62 to, I think, 1994. Was recorded, I think, 43 times during those sessions for Infidels. 43 versions, 43 takes, some of which were complete, some of which were not. I think there were 14 complete takes, Halen notes in his book of Foot of Pride. So Dylan himself must have felt like he was onto something special, right? Well, he was. I do think this song belongs on this list of 10 gems from Bob Dylan's 1980s period. Definitely check it out in the description of this video. Okay. Now I mentioned Too Late. Too Late and a different version. So Foot of Pride first comes out on Bootleg Series Volume 3, which was recorded in tandem with Volumes 1 and 2. It was a 3-disc set released in 1991. Killer version of Foot of Pride on there. But I was shocked to hear how great the much later released version of Foot of Pride is on the bootleg series called Springtime in New York, which documents a lot of the outtakes and live performances from this period in Dylan's career. There's a booming, rocking version on that bootleg series as well that features Mark Knopfler doing some great work on guitar. That's Bootleg Series Volume 16, Springtime in New York, that also has that song Too Late on it, which, again, very different musically, much more acoustically oriented. Many of the similar lyrics from Foot of Pride. Both songs, both versions on Volume 16 of the Bootleg series are killer tracks, among the best of Dylan's career, in my opinion. That Bootleg Series Volume 3 version is slower and sparer musically, and therefore spotlights that kind of biting nature of Dylan's vocal delivery that Tom Ward alludes to. Then you got Lou Reed's live cut. I'll link to that in the description of this video as well. This is all brilliant stuff. Foot of Pride is holds a very special position in the entirety of Dylan's canon, not just his 1980s output. Number 4 is I and I. This I have long considered to be one of my favorite Bob Dylan songs of all time. I don't care what decade or year he recorded it in. It's attached to this hilarious story involving Leonard Cohen, which Far Out Magazine recalls as follows. In contrast to Dylan, Cohen's process required him to slowly chip away at an idea, to sand it down until it no longer seemed a product of his own mind. The pair being Dylan and Cohen, differing approaches were summed up by a conversation they once shared in which Bob asked Leonard how long it took him to write the song Hallelujah. Now that's from Leonard's 1984 album, Various Positions, which at first was not released in the United States, but only in Europe. It was thanks in part to Bob Dylan taking it upon himself to start performing Hallelujah live for audiences throughout a tour that he was on at the time, to help broaden awareness of the song Hallelujah that we now know today to be one of Leonard's most famous songs, if not his most famous. Cohen replied to Dylan that it took him 10 years to write Hallelujah. So Leonard says, how long did it take you to write I and I? 15 minutes, Dylan says. Now, on the documentary about Cohen's song Hallelujah that was released just a couple years ago, someone says in that documentary that Bob was just kidding. He was kidding. But it's a great story to have attached to I and I. Now, that phrase I and I apparently derives from Rastafarian vocabulary, and I found an explanation of that here, which I'll link to in the description as well. I and I is a complex term referring to the oneness of Jah, God, and every human. Rastafarian scholar E.E. Cashmore says, I and I is an expression to totalize the concept of oneness, the oneness of two persons. So God is within all of us, and we're one people, in fact. I and I means that God is in all men. So that's part of the inspiration behind the title of the track. Now, the musical personnel behind Bob on this track is really without rival. I mean, he's recording this with Mark Knopfler of Dire Straits. Mick Taylor plays guitar. This is a guy that's worked not just with Dylan but with the Rolling Stones. Alan Clark, the Dire Straits keyboardist and co-producer, plays. Robbie Shakespeare and Sly Dunbar, Sly and Robbie, who themselves are a legendary duo who have worked with everyone from the Stones and Dylan to No Doubt and Red Hills Road, Biddy McLean, Underwater Dub, Bill Laswell. I mean, they've done a hell of a lot over a long period of time. This was Dylan's backing group on the track I and I, so no wonder it turned out to be brilliant. You can find several versions of this track. There's the studio version released on Infidels. But again, going back to that Bootleg Series Volume 16, Springtime in New York, there's a different version on there with some truly gorgeous Mark Knopfler guitar work that is worth the price of admission alone. Definitely check that out in the links in the description. Number 3 on my list, Dark Eyes, from that record that, again, Bruce Springsteen, in his brief commentary introducing Bob Dylan to the crowd, inducting him into the 1988 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, specifically names Empire Burlesque as a record that in its entirety would have was as worthy of any notice that Dylan had accrued to himself with any of his other output, and would have, as he said, earned any younger songwriter at the time the praise of the new Bob Dylan. Dylan focuses on this song in his 2004 National Book Award nominated memoir, Chronicles Volume 1, saying that it was inspired by a moment he says he saw a prostitute in a hallway at the Plaza Hotel on 59th Street in New York City. He says, as I stepped out of the elevator, a call girl was coming toward me in the hallway, pale yellow hair, wearing a fox coat, high-heeled shoes that could pierce your heart. She had blue circles around her eyes, black eyeliner, dark eyes. She looked like she'd been beaten up and was afraid that she'd get beat up again. In her hand, crimson purple wine in a glass. I'm just dying for a drink, she said as she passed me in the hall. She had a beautifulness, but not for this kind of world, poor wretch, doomed to walk this hallway for 1,000 years. Even in his own recollections of his own songs, he's lyrical in that way. John J. Moser, talking about this song, he included it on a list of Dylan's top 10 songs about getting older. It was number 8 on Rolling Stone's poll of 10 best Bob Dylan songs of the 1980s. Gigwise named this song one of Dylan's 11 most underrated songs. Tom Waits said of Dark Eyes that it's one of his favorite Bob Dylan songs. Patti Smith, who's covered it, duetted it live with Dylan, has said that it comes in the tradition, it's written in the tradition of John Milton and William Blake. She calls the lyrics very beautiful and says that they stand out as a poem. I would agree, which is why I would like to read the song in its entirety to you, to hear just how beautiful Dylan's writing was in this so-called nadir of his career in the 1980s. Here are the lyrics to Dark Eyes from Empire Burlesque, 1985. Oh, the gentlemen are talking and the midnight moon is on the riverside. They're drinking up and walking, and it is time for me to slide. I live in another world where life and death are memorized, where the earth is strung with lovers' pearls, and all I see are dark eyes. A cock is crowing far away, and another soldier's deep in prayer. Some mother's child has gone astray. She can't find him anywhere. But I can hear another drum beating for the dead that rise, whom nature's beast fears as they come, and all I see are dark eyes. They tell me to be discreet for all intended purposes. They tell me revenge is sweet, and from where they stand, I'm sure it is. But I feel nothing for their game, where beauty goes unrecognized. All I feel is heat and flame, and all I see are dark eyes. Oh, the French girl, she's in paradise, and a drunken man is at the wheel. Hunger pays a heavy price to the falling gods of speed and steel. Oh, time is short and the days are sweet, and passion rules the arrow that flies. A million faces at my feet, but all I see are dark eyes. And what songwriter wouldn't want that song to their credit, okay? Give me a break that Dylan, his stuff in the 80s wasn't worth listening to. Garbage, nonsense. That's great stuff. Check it out. It's the closing track on Empire Burlesque from 1985. Series of Dreams is number 2 on my list. Daniel Lanois, this poor guy, begged Bob to include this. He wanted it to be the opening track on Oh Mercy in 1989. Bob adamantly refused. Wasn't going to happen. And Dylan talks about this again in his 2004 memoir, Chronicles Volume 1 about the tension that this track caused between himself and Lanois, of which there was plenty, by the way, especially in Dylan's description of those sessions with Daniel Lanois throwing equipment around the studio. It's a pretty heated tale. Dylan said of this song, although Lanois liked the song, he liked the bridge better. He wanted the whole song to be like that. I knew what he meant, but it just couldn't be done. Though I thought about it for a second, thinking that I could probably start with the bridge as the main part and use the main part as the bridge, the idea didn't amount to much, and thinking about the song this way wasn't healthy, whatever that means. I felt like it was fine the way it was, didn't want to lose myself in thinking too much about changing it. This is, no matter its fate, a sublime, beautiful, and mystical recording in Dylan's canon. It has seen several versions released over the years. You get the Bootleg Series Volume 3 version released in 1991. That's beautiful, for which Dylan and Lanois both, I think, worked on some overdubs to prepare it for release on that collection. Then in Bootleg Series Volume 8, that one's Telltale Signs, released in 2008. You get this rawer, less polished, more demo-like rendition. I think it's definitely of interest as well. I'll include links to both in the description of this video. Number one on my list of gems from Bob Dylan's 1980s period has to be Blind Willie McTell. I think this is one of the finest songs Dylan has ever recorded. There are people who call it the greatest song of his life. There's this wonderful description of it by Peter Tabakis, which I think came out in a publication called Spectrum Culture, in which, talking about Blind Willie McTell, he says, again, as I mentioned earlier, he calls it a 6-minute repudiation of any argument that somehow insists that Dylan's 80s output was fallow. But he goes on to say this: the song, with its spare and dramatic piano backbone by Dylan himself, accented with Knopfler's haunting guitar notes, seems performed in an open field at midnight. The tableau is as cinematic as Dylan gets. An arrow swings on a doorpost. An owl hoots. Feathered maidens strut. Martyrs fall. A canopy of stars hovering over barren trees transforms into an uproarious crowd. Listen to this. We're 10 songs into this list now. And again, you've heard music critics, you've heard peers of Dylan, songwriting peers of his, you've heard Dylan scholars talking about these songs that he put out in the 1980s in the same language one would use to describe what is commonly considered to be Dylan's greatest work, typically the 1960s stuff. Grail Marcus, talking about Blind Willie McTell, said it, quote, has emerged as one of Dylan's greatest songs, or even perhaps in the right mood, his greatest song. From the start, it had a burgeoning charisma. The more you played it, the more demanded that the volume go up a fraction every time until you hit the limit and realized it still wasn't loud enough. Patterson Hood of Drive-By Truckers told Stereogum a few years ago that with McTell as a starting point, Dylan constructed a time travel from slave days through the Jim Crow South with a kitchen sink full of Delta imagery, Bible scripture, and vaudevillian shuck and jive. Yet, as it goes with the best of songs, it also remains elusive and mysterious, benefiting as much from what it leaves out as for what it actually says. Michael Gray, in his book Song and Dance Man, The Art of Bob Dylan, includes a whole chapter on this song and its musical and historical background. The Guardian, in an article from 2001, included the song, again, on that 80 Bob Dylan songs everyone should know list. Rolling Stone talked with Dylan about this song in an interview, and the interviewer said, Dylan, he can't possibly be sorry that the world has had the benefit of hearing, for instance, Blind Willie McTell, an outtake from 1983's Infidels. Right, this is yet another song that was left off of the official release of the record for which it was recorded, that has subsequently risen as high in most people's Dylan pantheon as a song can rise, and that he himself has played live since, can he? Bob Dylan said, I started playing it live because I heard the band doing it. Most likely it was a demo, probably showing the musicians how it should go. It was never developed fully. I never got around to completing it. There wouldn't have been any other reason for leaving it off the record. It's like taking a painting by Monet or Picasso and going to his house, looking at a half-finished painting and grabbing it and selling it to the people who are Picasso fans. Listen, I don't care how half-baked he thinks the song is. Half-baked or fully fledged, it's freaking brilliant. And it's brilliant in a multitude of versions. You get it on Bootleg Series Volume 3. There's that haunting piano and acoustic guitar version recorded with Mark Knopfler. Then in Bootleg Series Volume 16, released in 2021, that begins, it's a different version, and I think it's equally as fascinating and stirring. Dylan's sort of stabbing at a piano in the opening verses of the song. Then you hear this Knopfler's electric guitar on this one, not acoustic guitar as on the Bootleg Series Volume 3 version. That's, to my ear, kind of reminiscent of Ry Cooder's slide guitar work. He's sort of pecking away at his guitar as Dylan stabs at that piano. And then around a minute into the song, the band kicks in. 20 seconds later, you get this really eerie, almost creepy harmonica work by Dylan. And you end up with a recording that I think is every bit as worthy of regard as its predecessor on Bootleg Volume 3. I've included links to both of those versions as well in the description as a link to a 1997 live version that Dylan performed. Lastly, as I mentioned at the top of this video, an honorable mention goes to a song called God Knows, yet another song that was recorded with Daniel Lanois for the Oh Mercy sessions and left off of the final recording. Again, much to Daniel's frustration. I want to also notice that there's a wonderful album. It's a tribute album to Dylan's 80s period that you can find a link to in the description as well. It's called A Tribute to Bob Dylan in the 80s, Volume 1. I don't think a subsequent volume ever was released, but the songs covered on there include Series of Dreams, Dark Eyes, Every Grain of Sand. You also got songs I've left off of this list, but easily could have included songs like Joker Man or Sweetheart Like You, one of those songs that Bruce Springsteen named in his induction of Dylan at the 1998 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony. So I hope that these 11 songs give you a roadmap through which to enter into Dylan's, I think, more frequently than advertised, brilliant work in the 1980s. Don't listen to the people who tell you that Dylan's work should be dismissed outright, that it's a waste of your time to even go there. Go there now. Go to the description of this video and check out the many links to these songs that I've included there, and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Dylan's 80s output in the comments on this video.